Christ, when he rose from the grave, he met with the disciples in that evening, right?
Yes.
But Peter and 6 others went fishing, and Christ went up to redeem Peter, restore Peter. And then I'm just curious at the time when he did, when Christ went up there, because Christ met with the disciples 3 times, right? Resurrection evening. I don't know the other one, but the third one was 8 days later. Could you help me out with that?
Sure. Yeah, you're exactly right. There were, Acts chapter 1 actually tells us that Jesus appeared and reappeared to the apostles many times over the period of 40 days. So as far as concerning what you're talking about, where Jesus and the rest of the other disciples were fishing, and then Jesus comes there on the Sea of Galilee and speaks to them. The time frame of that, we're going to try to help you out with that. So Brad, I'm going to give that over to you and let you have a shot at it, and then I'll make a comment after you're done.
Okay, yeah. I as far as the actual, as far as the dates and what you're talking about in that regard, I think Pastor Scott's going to be better than that. But I do want to hit a point before I bring it back to Scott, and that is this: it's really important that we as believers do not take lightly the fact that Jesus not just rose from the dead, but that he appeared to many people. From an evidentiary perspective, that's extremely important. We a large number, I think it was like 500, saw him actually ascend into heaven. But the fact that Jesus appeared many times is real important, number one. And number two is the fact that those who gave their lives for testifying to Jesus' resurrection, they all said, we saw Jesus risen from the dead, and that's our hope, and that's why we're preaching the gospel, is not for the teachings of Jesus, but that Jesus died on the cross and rose again from the dead, and but for that, everything we're saying would be rubbish and in vain and a waste of time. And so I think that's should be very comforting to us as believers, knowing that as a matter of history, historians, both believers and non-believer historians, like Josephus is a non-believer historian, attested to these basic facts of the early church, that Jesus not only came and died on the cross, but that his followers gave their lives on the basis that they saw Jesus risen from the dead. That is extremely valuable and important to us, especially as we're talking to non-believers who may doubt things like the resurrection.
Exactly. And also what's interesting is, as far as breaking this down, and I like what Brad said, because again, if you read Acts chapter 1, that's what Luke actually tells us there. He says that, Jesus appeared to his disciples over a period of 40 days, showing himself with many infallible proofs that he was alive. And so, that is so important because that gives us the confidence to know, of course, the disciples to know and us to know that Jesus definitely rose from the dead. If you remember, Paul actually mentions in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus was, seen by the different people who saw him, Peter and these. And then he said, then after the disciples, then he said that Jesus actually was seen by a group of 500 of believers. 500 brethren actually saw him. And so very, very important that Jesus showed himself alive to the disciples over that period of time. Now, so getting to your question, if you read John chapter 20, the idea we get here is during the evening of the resurrection. It tells us in chapter 20, verse 19, then the same day at evening, the first day of the week, all the disciples were there hiding out because they were afraid that the same people who arrested Jesus and put him to death were going to do the same thing to them. And so they were hiding out, and Jesus appears to them. And this is where he appears to them, and then he breathes on them, and they receive the Holy Spirit, and he gives them John's version of the Great Commission, and says, if you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven, and if you retain the sins of any, they're retained. And so that's John's version of the Great Commission, that they were to go to share the gospel. Those who put their faith in it were forgiven. Those who rejected are not. But then we see later in John chapter 20, in verse 26, it says, then 8 days later, after 8 days, the disciples were again inside. So here they are, they're still there in the upper room. And this is when Jesus appears to them and has this exchange with Thomas. But then what we see is when we come to chapter 21, in verse 1, it says, after these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And so the Sea of Tiberias is the Sea of Galilee. Now, what's interesting, if you go back to the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, it actually tells us that the angel spoke to, or that Jesus, when he speaks to the women who came to the tomb, speaks to Mary, actually says, go tell my brothers, that I'm alive. And he actually says to them, and tell them I'm going to meet them in Galilee. Now, he didn't meet them in Galilee alone, because again, John makes it very clear that he was there with his disciples on the night of the resurrection, and then also 8 days later. But according to John's gospel, when you come to chapter 21, then we see the disciples there at the Sea of Galilee. This is where Peter's fishing and all of that's going on. And that is where Jesus then confronts Peter and restores his relationship with Peter and restores his commission to be an apostle. And so this was some time later, but the time gap between the resurrection and Jesus' ascension was 40 days. So these are the different appearances we have that coincide together, and that's how it appears that they're laid out. So does that help at all?
Yeah, because I know that Christ told the women to tell the disciples to go to Galilee, but that he has to go to Galilee and to send the disciples up there. What threw me off was he met with them in the evening of the resurrection and gave them the commission. I believe that was chapter 20. It was the fishing trip that bothered me, because this guy was messing it up and saying everything was about the fishing trip, when it was really about restoring relationship with Peter, because Christ asked Peter 3 times, do you love me?
Do you love me?
I got that
right.
part. Just the timing of all of it messed me up.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting, Howard? It is interesting, right? Because Jesus did tell the women, hey, go tell the disciples, I'm going to meet them in Galilee, at a certain mountain and all of that. But what did they do? They, number one, when the women first came back, they didn't believe them. They didn't believe them Jesus rose from the dead, so that's why Peter and John run to the tomb to check it out for themselves. But you'll find out that even though these are what we would call, right, the apostles, men that Jesus chose himself to carry the gospel to the world, you will find out that they were not always completely obedient to Jesus. So instead of going to Galilee, what did they do? They hid out in the upper room, but at the same time, Jesus doesn't chide him for that. He doesn't rebuke him for that. What Jesus does is he shows up in his loving way, shows up and shows himself alive, breathes on them with the Holy Spirit, and then comes back 8 days later. They're still there in the same room because they're scared. They're scared to death. And then finally we see, that they finally do go to Galilee. And when they do, Peter is just absolutely, what do we want to say? Just so guilt-ridden over his rejection of Jesus and how he denied him. And so really, as you said, Howard, that's the whole point of the exchange that happened there in the Galilee with Peter, was to restore his soul and his relationship with the Lord, and to recommission him, to give him that commission to go and to preach the gospel and to feed his sheep. And very important. And I think Galilee is very important because that was the center of Jesus' ministry. His ministry was headquartered on the Sea of Galilee out of Capernaum. That is where Peter was from. So Jesus was taking the disciples right back to where it all started and wanted them to have a brand new, fresh start. So it's really wonderful.